Lynn, we've never met before, but
No, we
it's a
haven't.
big thrill for me. I'm a huge fan.
Thank you.
And I actually was just reading Citizens of London not too long ago on a plane to England on a British Airways flight, and I feel like I got a lot of good glances, very people that understood the book and knew about it, so that was fun. But I just wanted to, so this movie, when it came out in 2005, they showed it before it's released to some test audiences, and apparently the main note they got was that the character playing Joe McCarthy was way over the top. So I'm going to assume the portrayal there was accurate, but I'm very interested to know what you think of the movie as a whole. Did it do justice to that moment, and particularly David Strathairn's portrayal of Edward Murrow?
I wrote the Murrow Boys with my husband Stan Cloud, and we were invited actually to see a screening of the film when George Clooney came to Washington. We live in Washington. The movie is not based at all on our book, although he said that they had used it. He had read it, and that they had used it as kind of a reference. But yeah, no, I think it's one of the very few historical movies based on actual people that I think is almost totally accurate. I mean, there are very, very few, and I really can't even think of any right now, scenes that never happened, or events and characters that were never there, as opposed to The Darkest Hour, which just came out, which some of you may have seen about Winston Churchill, and I've written a lot about Winston Churchill, and there were a lot of things that never happened.
I don't think that scene on the tube happened.
The scene in the tube, yes, especially. But no, but I do have a and David Strathairn is brilliant as Edward R. Murrow. There is no question. I mean, he is Edward R. Murrow. I have a funny story to tell about that, because when our book came out in 1996, it was optioned for film option, and you know the agony of working in film. It actually never got made, but the producer asked us in 1996 who we thought should play Edward R. Murrow, and I said David Strathairn, and he laughed, and my husband laughed, and said basically David Strathairn has kind of a high voice normally, and they both say he looks absolutely nothing like Edward R. Murrow, and you can see he in fact does. And when this came out, there were a lot of big "I told you so."
You should get some credit for that somehow.
Yeah.
That might have planted the seed. Who knows?
Yeah. Well, I just think he was brilliant. I think the cinematography was absolutely brilliant as well. I mean, those close-ups, especially when you're sitting down here as I was, it's really remarkable. And the close-ups were a lot on Strathairn, and he was just in character the whole time.
Yeah, and I actually think I believe they shot it in color film and then took the color out, mainly because, or a big consideration was they wanted to use the archival footage of McCarthy.
Right.
Because they didn't want to have an actor. I guess everyone would have seemed over the top playing that. But there was an interesting moment in the film early on that I wanted to ask you about, when the character of Joseph Wershba, played by Robert Downey Jr., is confronted with that file in the hallway and says, the reason you're going to lose this is because everybody knows Edward R. Murrow is a loyal American. And I think that strikes me as true. But it makes me wonder if Edward R. Murrow could ever exist again today, because there's just everything, not only the stations and the formats and the internet is all cable news fragmented, but the audience is fragmented. Could anybody ever have the kind of credibility again to take on that kind of problem so effectively? I
don't think so. I mean, I think you have to remember why Murrow got that credibility. This goes back, as he had been with CBS since the early 30s, mid 30s, when CBS was nothing. I mean, there was that scene between Paley and Murrow where Murrow basically said, "I made you." That the news department made CBS, and that's true. When Ed Murrow went to London in 1937, he was not sent there as a reporter. He was sent there as director of talks. There were no such thing as broadcast reporters then.
Director of talks.
Director of talks, European talks. What that meant was that he was supposed to arrange for talks or speeches by people like Winston Churchill. He was supposed to arrange for programs of boys' choirs. You know, no reporting at all. And he basically single-handedly created the idea of a broadcast reporter. He and the men he hired, who were called the Murrow Boys, the younger correspondents that Nancy referred to, people like Eric Severide, Charles Collingwood, Howard K. Smith, Richard, just all that, those great reporters. And this was the first time that had ever been done. And NBC joined in eventually, but the CBS team covering the war was really the preeminent news team in American journalism. And within a year, if you can believe this, within a year when they started reporting, the #1 medium of news in the United States when the war began was radio. In just a year, it went from newspapers to radio. That's why Murrow was listened to. Murrow was believed when he reported from London, which is where he was based for the war. And he directed this team of correspondents that was, as Nancy said, was fanning out all over Europe and even in Asia. So he came with that, that backlog of trust. And he was certainly the most distinguished and certainly the most popular reporter, American reporter, during World War II. So the American people really did trust him. So he did come with that, and that's really impossible now,
right.
I think.
And I mean, you think of it a little bit with Walter Cronkite in a famous broadcast about the Vietnam War, when people sort of felt, if Walter Cronkite is starting to lean against it, then so it just makes you wonder about sort of the power of journalism in terms of having sort of a point man or woman, a point person.
Right.
But I want to ask you one thing about the Murrow Boys, which is a fantastically fun read. I don't mean no slant. It's so much fun to read the book. It just breezes through, and it's fascinating every page. You're talking about a speech at some point that Eric Severide made in 1951 at the University of Minnesota, and in that context, you used a phrase that fascinates me: truthless objectivity. And I sort of latched onto that, again, thinking about what we're facing today. And I wanted to get your thoughts about one thing, which is, so what I thought of when I heard truthless objectivity, and I think it was being used as a kind of an argument to say, listen, these aren't automatons, these correspondents. If they're reporting on the Birmingham bus bombing or some visceral right and wrong that's happening, they have to be able to, and so now you sort of see this, what I think of kind of lazy both sidesism on cable news. So instead of objectivity, sort of you think of as facts, having facts put out there, and they basically seem to just let two people yell at each other, and then nobody is in real time providing factual analysis or objectivity. So this is what Eric Severide said. I don't mean to, but he said, our rigid formulae of so-called objectivity have given the lie the same prominence and impact as the truth is given. They have elevated the influence of fools to that of wise men. He said that in 1951, and it's hard not to think of him calling to us, from then. And related to that, a very short line from Howard K. Smith, who you mentioned. He said, I refuse to believe that right is an equidistant point between good and evil. And so I guess my question is, how do you see truthless objectivity in the news today? Is it a problem now? Was it a problem then?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's always been a problem in news. I mean, it's a dispute that goes on constantly and has for years and years. Certainly, this is just a tip of the iceberg. This is Good Night and Good Luck, and this occurred in the mid-50s. Murrow was, as you can see, was on his way out because having made CBS, Paley decided that CBS was now the #1 network, thanks to the news department, and he was after ratings and money, which you saw. And if the sponsors were unhappy, he was unhappy. And he didn't care about, he really didn't care about the news, quite frankly, after that. And so he was pushing, he had been pushing that during the war. He pushed it all the way through. But it was going on in newspapers. It has been the story of journalism from the beginning. And we certainly are seeing it now. I mean, I can't tell you the conversations that Stan and I have at home when we see things like the Sinclair broadcasting system. I mean, can you imagine what Murrow would say about that? Having these anchors and these on-air correspondents reading the same garbage over their, in their specific stations. I mean, I'm really sorry we don't have an Edward R. Murrow, because he would, if he were on See It Now, he would go on the air the next week and condemn that. But it's happening, and cable is very much part of that. I mean, I hate to say this, but thank God for print. No, I don't hate to say this, but because I don't mean to say that all broadcast journalism is bad. That's not true. It is. CNN is doing some really good stuff. Others are doing some really good stuff. But thank God for print journalism. Quite frankly,
yeah,
thank God for the New York Times, the Washington Post.
Right. Those are our Edward R. Murrows now.
Those are our Edward R. Murrows now.
But it's interesting because in your book you actually point out a little more than the film does, for understandable reasons, that Murrow was actually a bit slow.
Yes.
And actually they make reference to the fact that he signed the loyalty oath.
Right.
That's actually, to me, pretty interesting. Yeah. And he signed it years before these broadcasts.
That's right, yeah.
And there was a lot of blood on the floor. A lot of people had lost their jobs. And so there was a little critical pushback, not much, when the film came out, saying, hey, that it's hagiography and that there's some that he was late and that McCarthy was already kind of had weakened enough. And Murrow's, I guess, he had answered that at certain times, saying we had to wait. We had to wait until we couldn't get out too far ahead of the public, otherwise we would have lost it. So I wondered if your book really delves into that.
Yeah, right. The thing to remember is that McCarthyism didn't start with McCarthy. It actually began around the mid 1940s. In 1946, again, shades of today, the Republicans took back the Congress. The Democrats had been in power under Franklin Roosevelt. And when Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945, the next congressional elections, the Cold War was starting, this kind of get tough on communism, and Republicans like Richard Nixon and Joseph McCarthy were elected on this, we've got to root out all these communists in the government, etc. So McCarthy came along in 1950. That's really when he started. But it was really the House Un-American Activities Committee that was really active in the late 1940s, and they were doing exactly the same thing that McCarthy was doing. They were looking for communists in Hollywood and in education and universities, etc. So when McCarthy just happened to be the guy who grabbed the television screens and the microphones by saying things like he did in 1950, holding up a thing. I have here the names of, I don't know how many, 50 communists, 200 communists or whatever.
The Manchurian candidate.
You're right, in the State Department. And so this had been going on, as I said, since the 1940s. And with McCarthy, it had been going on since 1950. This show was in 1954. Murrow was he was slow in taking him on. And we explain in the book that he never really talked about why, but I think there were several things. One thing is his health was going downhill. You saw how he was smoking in that film. That is how he was.
3 packs a day.
I think probably more. He never, ever was without a cigarette in his hand. Never. And as you can see, everybody else was smoking too, but he had been doing that since he was, in his 20s. And certainly in London, he did it. He was smoking all the time. So by the time the 1950s came around, he looked a lot older. He was only in his 40s then, and he looked a lot older. Early 40s. He looked a lot older, and so his health was getting bad. He only lived another less than 10 years after this.
Died of lung cancer.
He died of lung cancer. And also, he had been a corporate player. When he came back after the war, he was made vice president of news. So he had become a corporate player. And, he was trying to navigate, both corporate, Paley, and the news department. And as you said, he kept telling most of the people that he was working for, including those guys, but also the correspondents that he had working with him in World War II, were really pressuring him to take on McCarthy. And in fact, some of them did it much earlier than Murrow did. Severide did. Howard K. Smith did. Collingwood didn't really at that point, but others did. Bill Shirer, who had been a Murrow boy. But he said that, he was really holding his powder, keeping his powder dry until the Radulovich basically started it. And then, but when he did, the power of that man, the influence of that man, that was a KO punch to McCarthy. He didn't start it, but he certainly, when this is probably the most influential documentary that has ever appeared on American television. So it helped push him over. But he was teetering on the cliff. McCarthy was already teetering on the cliff, and he just gave him a push.
And then
over.
there was the "Have you no sense of decency?"
Have you no sense?
Right. Which was 3 months after the broadcast.
Right. They made it look like the Army McCarthy hearings, where that's another one of those great speeches. The lawyer for the Army, Joseph Welch.
Yeah, terrific.
Do you have no sense of decency?
Who was helpfully an actor as well, had been an actor in Hollywood.
I know, and he was in that famous movie with Jimmy Stewart. Pardon? Anatomy of a Murder. Yes, he played the judge in Anatomy of the Murder.
Well, he kind of murdered Joseph McCarthy there, and he. It's funny because right at the end of the film, there's a reference to the fact that where Murrow and Fred Friendly say, well, McCarthy gets to stay, but and you're being forced out. But of course, McCarthy drank himself to death.
Yes, yeah, he didn't last long after that. Yeah.
So we're going to open it, but I just wanted to ask one last question. You brought up Sinclair Media, which is interesting, but I guess in those days, birth of television, the commercial pressure on the news was sort of done in big, bold lines. Like there was Alcoa would say to Bill Paley, get him to do this, and it was very easy to see. One of the problems I'm having now when I try to analyze this stuff is I'm not sure of Sinclair Media's, I'm not sure what motivates them. I'm not sure what motivates, the more extreme, strident news outlets. And I'm wondering how that pressure manifests now. In the old days, in this movie, it's very satisfying to see. But now you sort of wonder, what is the pressure that's getting into the newsroom? What's messing with the scripts now?
Well, I think they're ideologues. As opposed to these guys with just the networks, that was the last thing they were ideologues. They were interested in money, ratings, and that was they're businessmen. Well, these guys are businessmen too, but I think they're very ideological. I'm not an expert at all, but they are far right. They have a far right. Orientation, and they're supported by many of the far right billionaires, and so it's a very different situation, I think.
All right. Well, let's open it up to questions for Lynne Olson. Right here.
Was that Robert Kennedy at the end of the tape?
Yes, that was. Did you catch him? Yeah. Robert Kennedy was at the end of the senators, the Democratic senators, and Cohn was on the other end. Yeah.
And I guess at the time he was just an aide to the committee.
Yeah, he was a counsel for the committee.
And there was that curt Bill Paley reference to do one on Joe Kennedy, and we'll pay for it.
Yeah,
I guess they wanted to. All right. I'm sorry. It's a little hard to see.
Yeah, it's hard to see.
Back here, gentlemen.
The relationship between Murrow and Fred Friendly.
That's a very good question, and that's a really good question. You have one of the great heartthrobs of America, George Clooney, playing Fred Friendly. Fred Friendly and Murrow did have a very, very tight relationship, but it was Fred Friendly was not popular among a lot of people at CBS News. He basically, especially in the minds of those who had been with Murrow during World War II, he basically bulldozed himself next to Murrow and, kind of just joined him hip to hip. And in later years, there was a lot of criticism that he was taking credit for a lot of what Murrow did. That he was basically, kind of not telling Murrow what to do, but was certainly the big guy in the duo. And in fact, there's a fabulous story about when we were doing research for this book. We went to interview Janet Murrow, Ed Murrow's widow, who was the loveliest, most ladylike, most patrician woman you can ever imagine. She was just fantastic. And we started talking to her about Fred Friendly, and she froze. And I knew that she didn't like him, but she froze. And she said to us, I guess she knew we were going to ask her about it. Our daughter had come with us. Our daughter at that point was about 5 years old, I guess. And she says, I'm going to take Carly out for a walk, and there's an envelope on the table that you might like to look at while we're gone. And, it's kind of like passing the envelope and so she did. She took Carly out for a walk, and we opened the envelope, and it was this long letter from Janet Murrow to Fred Friendly, blasting him for what he was trying to kind of hijack the image of Edward R. Murrow, make it his. And she really...
From what year was that? Was that early on? Or?
No, it was after he died.
Okay.
After Ed Murrow died. After Murrow died. They were very close. Fred Friendly was, the engine for See It Now. There's no question. And he really was, the two of them were jointly responsible for this, for the McCarthy and for the other wonderful See It Now episodes that they made. That was, it looks it is old-fashioned, but See It Now was the first magazine show. 60 Minutes is its successor. I mean, there's no question. So it had a tremendous influence, and I don't know if any of you they talked about Don in the control room. That was Don Hewitt, who was the executive producer of 60 Minutes. He was a very young director, CBS director, and he did most of the See It Now shows.
And also Robert Downey Jr.'s character,
Joe Wershba
went on to become a 60 Minutes
producer. Yes,
right.
Actually, so did Palmer. The guy whose ex-wife was or was not a communist. He also, I interviewed him. He also went on to become a 60 Minutes producer. He stayed with. Murrow protected him.
As far as Fred Friendly, George Clooney played him rather quietly, but I noticed your description of him in your book was New York native. Friendly was a 6'4", 200-pound volcano of a man known for his roisterous enthusiasms and violent temper tantrums.
Yeah.
So I guess he was a little more emotive.
Yes, he certainly was. Yeah.
Right. So any other right here?
I seem to recall a documentary from my youth called Harvest of Shame.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if Murrow was connected with that or
Yes.
CBS News, and it actually seemed to be a documentary that made a difference.
Yeah, the question was about Harvest of Shame, and the question was, did Murrow have anything to do with it? And you said that it seemed to have made a difference. And yes, it was. It was not See It Now. It was CBS Reports, which took the place of See It Now. And Murrow did a few of those. He was not in charge of it. Basically after the McCarthy. This McCarthy documentary, Paley really wanted nothing more to do with him, and they did do those 5 new See It Now programs, and then that was the end of See It Now, and then Murrow did CBS Reports, and they basically kind of shoved him out of the way, and in 1960, after John Kennedy had been elected president, he asked Murrow to become head of the United States Information Agency, the USIA, which Janet Murrow told us was this great and wonderful gift to him, so that meant that he could, that he could leave CBS gracefully, and but he didn't last very long, because within a year after he became USI director, he was diagnosed with lung cancer.
All right, just a couple more back here.
Lynne, can you talk about your transition from being the AP reporter to writer of historical events?
I was a journalist for 12 years with the AP first, and I must give a shout out right now to Nancy. And I did graduate from the U of A, and I graduated from the journalism. It was a department then, not a school, and it really changed my life. Journalism, I became a journalist because of the professors at the J School, and so University of Arizona and Tucson mean a lot to me. My parents lived here. Some friends of my mom's came today. My mother died a number of years ago, but they came today, and it's lovely to see you guys. So yes, I was a journalist for 12 years. I was with the AP. Then I went to the Baltimore Sun in the White House, in the Washington Bureau, and I decided I was sick of daily journalism, daily deadlines, and I wanted to write something that was more substantive. And so I became a freelance reporter, a freelance writer. My husband was also a journalist. He was with Time magazine. And so after a few years, I decided I wrote magazine articles, and I decided I was going to try to write books. And that's really what I wanted to do. It's not as hard to write a book as it is to get a movie made, but it's still very hard to find somebody who wants to publish your first book. And so Stan and I came up with the idea for the Murrow Boys. That was our first book. And God, what a great book to start with, because a lot of these people were still alive then. This was the early 1990s when we started research. And so we interviewed everybody. We interviewed Bill Shirer. We got to him 2 months before he died. And it's a wonderful interview. This doesn't even talk about it, but one of the great stories in the Murrow Boys is that Bill Shirer and Ed Murrow were best friends. They were the two beginners. They were the two first correspondents of the Murrow Boys. I mean, Shirer was his initial recruit, his initial hire, and they covered the beginning of the war together. As Hitler was marching through Austria, when they took over part of the Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland.
Shirer wrote Berlin Diaries.
Yes, and Shirer wrote Berlin Diary, and later Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. But so they were really very close, and then they had a big falling out. It's a great Shakespearean story. So we interviewed him right before he died about that, and he was just as angry at Edward R. Murrow then as he had been, in the 1940s. And Howard K. Smith, we interviewed him many times. Who else? Anyway, a lot of the Murrow Boys were still around. We interviewed a lot of those young producers. We interviewed them. And we interviewed Hewitt, we interviewed Dan Rather, we got almost everybody that had been around, in the early days. So it was just this wonderful education in broadcast journalism, from the guys who created it. I can't tell you how much fun it was to do the research. So that was the first book, and then actually writing that book kind of put me on the path to the kind of histories that I've written since, which is about World War II, basically, and about the Britain in World War II. And the reason was just because I fell in love with the period, and I fell in love with the city, thanks to doing the research about London when Murrow was there, because Murrow obviously made his name in London. So Sam and I did a huge amount of research about not only what he was doing, but about the city and what was going on, Winston Churchill, etc. So that really has, the Murrow Boys really was the beginning of everything for me.
And the latest, Last Hope Island, is a wonderful read. Just came out, I guess, last year, pretty recently.
Last year,
so,
yeah.
Over here, we're getting to the end here.
I just want to say that the Murrow Boys book is probably one of the best books I've ever read, so I think everybody here should actually read it, because it was very insightful.
Oh, thank you.
It's right here.
Insight that you were actually able to interview the folks. That's why it's so good.
Thank you.
The other thing I'd like to mention is that 35 years ago, I actually heard Art Linkletter talk about Bill Paley was a good friend of mine, and I wanted to be on this new program called 60 Minutes, but at that time he said I was too much of a TV personality and not a newsman. So I thought, gee, that's kind of interesting that that decision was made. The last question I have for you is with regards to what happens to the characters that wrap up the end of the movie with regards to the lieutenant that was being court-martialed in the Air Force or whatever. Is there any kind of follow-on that you have based upon your knowledge of having written in the area?
No, we know that he was reinstated. I don't know what happened to him after that. I have no knowledge of that. I think Annie Lou Moss, which is, again, that poor woman was not a communist. She had been falsely accused.
I guess Murrow had no evidence. Often,
no,
just
I mean,
nothing. He had
I know.
nothing.
It's just, I mean, yeah, McCarthy. Yeah, no,
McCarthy,
yeah, right, exactly. I mean, and I thought this is really a movie that everybody in this country should see, I think, because I think they did a brilliant job of pulling. At least half this movie was really documentary footage. This is actual footage, and when it was McClellan, I think, that was going on after McCarthy about, how can you do this? You say that this woman is guilty of a crime, and you say there are documents, and she doesn't see them. We can't see them. You can't do that. You can't try her like that. And so I think the ideas under this, the ideas that Clooney et al. Was trying to get across are just brilliant in this, and they have so much relevance to what's going on today. So I really recommend that everybody who hasn't seen this film should see it.
I think Clooney deserves some credit. He had been injured while he was filming Syriana not long before this film was made, and so he couldn't get insured. He couldn't get, I guess, bonded as an actor, and so he had to mortgage his house to pay for the insurance for himself, and then he paid himself $1 each for directing, writing, and acting. So it mattered to him.
That's the only reason this movie got made, is because of George Clooney. And George Clooney wanted to make this movie because of his father, Nick Clooney, who is a former anchor, TV anchor, lovely, lovely guy. And George Clooney grew up idolizing his father, and his father idolized Ed Murrow. And so that's really, so George Clooney has idolized Ed Murrow ever since he was a little boy.
Right. And so the reason we saw this movie today was because of Lynne Olson, the member of the inaugural Hall of Fame class at the University of Arizona School of Journalism. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Will. Thanks.